Terrific. Well, welcome everybody to this episode of Trust Me, I Know What I'm Doing. I feel like I have the signature guest for the title of this podcast, on today in Melissa Mahtani. Melissa, thank you so much for joining us.
It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
I was thinking about our session, especially in the last few days, something that very personal and yet important in the art world happened, the passing of an incredible tabla artist, Zakir Hussain. And what struck me about this was on the day that he passed, of course, many, many hours before, there were really lots and lots of reports of his death that were prematurely reported. And of course, it was finally confirmed by family and others in the news much, much later on. But it was sort of a reminder of all the challenges that are out there in effectively reporting news and trying to, in a way, control what that effective reporting is. So it was a reminder to me to think about this in talking to you today. Why is it just so incredibly challenging to cultivate trust these days, especially with the speed, availability of information that's out there, and of course, misinformation?
Totally. I mean, and I know, the example you were talking about, we were following that. We were following that in the hours before it was verified. And, I think one thing, just people always have to remember when you're reporting on people that they are human beings. And can you imagine what it was like for their family to read prematurely that somebody they love has died? Like, there are real world consequences to what we do. But to answer your question, I think it's hard. It's become harder for people to have trust because we live in echo chambers with social media, with, the speed of information, and actually just with the proliferation of types of different information that you can get. We are really saturated. Sometimes people are trying to be first, but really, it's hard. It's becoming harder for people to trust what they see because there's so much of it that the onus now has to be on the person to actually go and check and verify what they're seeing is real, or just make sure that they have a relationship with an organization that they can trust. And I think it's on us to try and restore that by being very transparent about how we verify what we verify so that people can begin to trust us again.
When you were trying to establish that transparency and that honesty in reporting, and particularly with the work you do, given the fact that you've been doing this for so long and your experiences here, are there mechanisms for that transparency to be obvious, to, in fact, do you have to call that out particularly so that audiences and people who are actually digesting this can cultivate that much more trust because they understand that it's a little bit more transparent, that there are periods where that honesty is more obvious? I hope that makes sense, because otherwise it's a very subtle thing that you have to some switch goes off and says, yes, well, I trust this person, I trust that person, or I trust that institution. Where do the kind of anchors lie here when it comes to that transparency, that honesty?
Yeah, it's funny. I was at a party, this Christmas party this weekend, and I was chatting to a couple of friends, and they said to me, what's one thing you wish people knew about your job? And I said to them, I wish more people understood the absolute amount of layers of verification that we have internally, the internal processes that we have to get things through standards, through legal, to make sure that we feel like our reporting is solid, that we've covered all angles, that we can be very confident in what we're saying. And it is such a process, over absolutely everything. And I wish people knew more of that, because then they would by nature have faith in what we do. I think historically they did, because that was the role of the media. And what you have is, especially in this country, where you can have anybody can start a YouTube channel, can buy a network. There are no rules and regulations like there are in some other countries. You are so saturated with people just trying to get in front of you that the trust has been eroded, especially because we live in a very polarized world, and people are not trying to be the public information that the media once was, but they're trying to push a certain point of view. To that end, the solution is we can and should, and one of the things that the Confirmed team tries to do is show you how the sausage is made and how we verified this, why, and bring you on that journey, something that we never needed to do before. But I don't think it hurts, and I think we can do more and more of it, not just so people will trust us, but so people can do it themselves. I always say to my team that it's not good enough for us to just say this is true or this is false. We need to show people how we came to that conclusion, and we need to teach them and empower them so that they can tell for themselves. And honestly, I think that's the most crucial thing that any of us can be doing at the moment.
That empowerment, of course, comes with with many edges and layers to it. And, in this area where we value that democratization, where you're right, everyone who has a camera, a phone, a YouTube channel, whether they have 50 layers or they have one layer, they have the opportunity to share and for other people to therefore digest. So, as a means for all to pursue truth, that might be wonderful. And that democratization actually helps. And yet, is this the open source to disruption and chaos? Is there a dance that you constantly have to do with empowerment and control?
I think it is more that people are getting their information from different places. And so you're never actually working from sort of a baseline of fact or a baseline of truth that everybody can agree on, because they will have seen this on whatever platform they're on, or they will have seen this slice of it, or they will have watched this report somewhere else.
It's a moving target.
It is a moving target. And I think that also the rise of influencers per se, or people who call themselves influencers on social media, is difficult because people really do trust those people, but you don't know where they're getting their facts from, if they're being paid by organizations, why they're pushing a certain narrative. And the dance that you're talking about is really when somebody says something that is demonstrably false. By the time you've demonstrated that, the damage has been done. And it's more of a race. And that's, again, why I think for us, with all of this noise that is going on, it's easy for us to feel helpless. And I say us, not just journalists, but like people in general, with all this chaos and confusion. The point is that we're hearing people say, I just don't know what to believe, so I don't believe anything anymore. And that's not right. When we come to empowerment, it's that if you can show people how they should tell for themselves or where to go for accurate information, people need to feel empowered and remember that they have agency. They have agency over what they read and what they watch. I always say to people that your media diet is just like your physical diet. It sounds very, very complicated, but when you and I think about like, okay, I want to eat well today, or I'm going to go to the grocery store and I'm going to buy an apple. We don't just take apples from strangers. We don't just pick up any apple. We'll like look at it. We'll see if it's bruised. We'll see like how it compares to the other apples. It happens very quickly and it's instinctive. And you almost need to be like that with your media. You need to look like, is it bruised? Is it an organization that has a good reputation and has been reliable? It's, somebody that I should trust. Let me check what all of the media is saying and make an informed decision rather than just hearing something or sharing something without actually clicking in and getting all the context.
And yet we live in a world where everything is reviews and it's Yelpified. And, I may not buy an apple because the place I bought it has like one bad review, or the other place that I might buy it has 25 great reviews. And, it sort of has taken away a little bit of the instinctive trial and error that comes with this. And with that, then, you mentioned influencers, but with that backdrop in mind, do news institutions still matter the same way as they used to, especially in this era? And are we seeing a rise of a maybe blend of news institutions in fact utilizing influencers and the power of some of this shift in how we digest and quote unquote shop for our media?
I would like to think that news organizations matter even more than they did. What I think is that people's media consumption habits have changed, and therefore we need to change. One of the things I've always tried to do in my career is reach people where they're at. So, I started off in traditional television with beta SP tapes before digital was even a thing. And we were like physically cutting tape, right? A long time ago. And then digital came along, and then social came along. And I was always experimenting, during that time I was with CNN and I launched their first like Instagram story. I launched shows on Facebook. So the journalism, I launched a podcast, but the journalism was always the same. It was always solid. It was just that we were using different ways to tell people because those were the different ways that people were consuming it. And I think that will continue to change, but the actual media is super relevant. We just need to make sure that we are reaching people kind of a platform specific way wherever they get their news. But, I also will go back to think about the beginning, those beginning days of the COVID pandemic. Everybody was searching for answers and people were going to the news because fundamentally news and media at its best, we are a public service. So yes, there are times where there is lots of noise, but in those really big moments, that's where that trust really needs to be cemented because we are actually impacting people's lives.
Yeah.
And, it's
walk me through something, because you mentioned sort of like maybe a timeline of this and how the platforms or even the methods change. But is there an anatomy to a story that, as you mentioned, there's so many layers and the process can be incredibly cumbersome in order to make it trustworthy for the public to consume. But is there a common thread here? Is there a common anatomy to an effective, well-sourced and evidence-based news story?
I think yes and no. Yes, because for us as journalists, like our basic storytelling method is more or less the same, right? You're looking to hear that something's happened. You're looking to, first of all, verify it, to make sure that you've got a couple of people that can corroborate it. You're looking for different sources, etc. Those kind of fundamentals stay the same, but each story is different. How I'm going to tell a story, for example, in a breaking news situation when we're just learning facts and, things are going on and God forbid it's like a school shooting, which is top of mind because we've just had one, when facts are scarce, versus something that is maybe a longer form where you're digging into something and trying to explain how it's changed. Like each story is different. But I think but there's the solid journalism and those skills don't change. It's just that we're adapting them to each platform wherever the story is going. So for example, like a 5-minute investigative piece on TV is going to look very, very different, like a 90-second social video,
Yeah.
But mentally the story and the tools to produce both are the same.
As your career has, cultivated this experience, have you at all learned to be that much more patient when it comes to ensuring that the concrete steps that are required to produce these pieces, whether it's a 5-minute segment or a 90-second piece on social media, has that patience served you well? And particularly trying to ensure that trust and facts are at the core of all this?
So, I think yes, to a certain degree. With experience and more years in the media, you kind of get used to it. And especially at this juncture or during the last election, we were taking extra steps to make sure that we were completely buttoned up and that we could show that to the audience. So we didn't want to just tell them; we wanted to show them how. But I will say that, really, if you ask any journalist, any producer, they will always be so impatient with the editors, with standards, with the legal process, because we're like, no, it's a great story. We want to get it out. And
Right.
Have you checked this? Have you thought about that? And it's like constant tension, but those layers and those verification processes make us better journalists. And it goes back to what I was saying at the beginning. Like, I do wish that people knew how many layers there are, because we go to great pains to make sure that what we are putting out and telling the public is so buttoned up, has been reported out, has been thoroughly vetted by so many people.
How is and I'm fascinated by this particular piece, but how is AI either lubricated the outcome of this, or for that matter disrupted these outcomes?
AI is such an interesting topic. And I will say, first of all, the first thing is, like, we have just had a huge election, and not just here in this country, but this year, 2024, was a year of elections, right? In January of 2024, all of us were saying, look at the role of AI and look at this and all these elections around the world. The threats of the deep fakes and the AI generated content, of course, there were some there, but it was by no means what we thought it was going to be. If anything, we saw it was way simpler methods. It was just news shared out of context, news that was like videos that was slowed down, or again, like chopped in half, things that we were calling cheap fakes that really, really made an impact. So I think, yes, AI is super important, but it's nowhere near that scary bogeyman that we were making it out to be. I think that AI is both a blessing and a curse. I think AI, first of all, we'll just, differentiate between AI and generative AI. So AI tools can be incredibly helpful, and we've been using them for ages. When we
Sure.
transcribe interviews, when, we all use predictive text or in our emails, and they can be helpful, in that way. Generative AI is a different beast. I think that I compare it very much to like nuclear, right? So
Yeah.
nuclear power can be incredibly powerful and useful if used in the right way with the appropriate guardrails and the right intent. But nuclear power can also be used to create bombs, and it can be dangerous, in the wrong hands.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
this is generative AI. It is going to be that next frontier that we're bracing in terms of sort of post-truth world that people are dubbing it, because you can very, very quickly create images, create videos that make it incredibly hard to tell what's true and what's not. Now, we can tackle that very responsibly with other tools, but it's this consistent race between like what we're trying to do with guardrails, what the technology is doing, how we're catching up. And again, it depends whose hands it's in and what the intent behind it is. And so I think it's going to be really, really interesting to see how that plays out and if there are regulations put in place. But it comes to the trust in the people who are putting the regulations in place.
I almost wonder if we're going to start labeling things as, 100% human versus, whether or not there's any kind of, machine involvement in all of this, and whether or not that will actually have an impact on what we consume or not. You and I we connect some dots here as global sort of South Asians. And I'm just so curious for you, how has your own sort of story as a global South Asian, how has that global South Asian story informed some of your work, particularly as a journalist, having gone through so many versions of what journalism is over the years?
I think that the one thing that I always come back to is that people are people, and that there is more that unites us and divides us, right? And I mean, I've lived and worked in many different countries. And you live in, different communities, or when you're from a different background, you can see that there's so much as humans that are the same across these big borders. And sometimes it's missed, especially being here in the US. I feel like we sometimes, when you work internationally, news is more international, right? Just because the world kind of is. And here, there is that difference. And I think that we kind of seem to see ourselves and others. There's this othering, if you like. And I think that we need to connect the dots for people. At least that's what I've always tried to do. Again, like how we feel here for when we're talking about women's rights, it's the same in other countries. When we talk about climate change or like water scarcity, it's the same here as it is for people over there. Like we're all fundamentally the same. And I think that all people want to be seen, heard, and treated with dignity. And we really need to connect those common bonds between us and listen to people. So we started off this interview talking about you and your role as a doctor and how you listen to your patients. And that's one of the most important things that you can do. It's the same thing in this polarized landscape that we're living in here. It's like people just want to be listened to. They want to feel that they can connect. And the more that we can do that, and the more that we can show how similar we all are, I think that that's one thing I would really, really like to do. And that's one thing that's informed every story that I've ever told.
No, and you're right. I mean, trying to help unwind that tribalism that happens as a baseline. And, it's one thing to be proud of your identity, of what your background is, and you can oftentimes be at high risk of losing that connection of what really bonds us all as humans. I'm thinking a little bit about, for you, perhaps, what with that backdrop, what you've had to maybe unlearn about yourself in keeping that top of mind, in finding success through evidence with the important work that you do and the stakes that are involved as well. Are there particular lessons or for that matter, unlearnings about yourself that you've really taken stock of over the years?
So, I had a very interesting upbringing. I was born in London, but I grew up in Zambia in Africa, and then traveled around and had grandparents who were from India, and then have lived in Europe and then moved here. So I think I've been so lucky to see how different people operate in different communities. I've been able to infiltrate a lot of them, which has helped a lot of my work when I'm trying to report on different communities to understand that. I've also come to appreciate how different communities and people perceive information. And if anything, that has always helped me think about how is a story that I'm trying to tell going to resonate, not just with people who are around me, but with people who aren't, with people who don't have a baseline of what I'm reporting on, and with people who are very informed. And I always feel that each story should kind of reach everyone. So
Right.
I think it's incredibly helpful in that sense. I think for a long time, and not so much now, but definitely in my late 20s and 30s, you have this kind of issue of identity, like where do I belong? Because you become like this global citizen. And I think that's just part of sort of growing up and gaining experience in your work and in who you are to realize that can actually be like, we are our own home.
We call that reclaiming yourself as an adult as you transition from adolescence.
But it can be, when you're living
Yeah.
in places, when you're not, close to the communities that you grew up in or have those safety nets, you can kind of get lost. One thing that I found very different when I first moved to the States 10 years ago is here everyone sort of has a label. There was TV that a certain community watches, or, and it was labeled as such, or the way that people spoke about other people was very blatant. That's not how I grew up in England. And especially when I was in Africa, like, they're just your friends. They don't have a narrative before what type of friend they are, or
Right.
what nationality or ethnicity they are. And it was very interesting to kind of be an outsider to kind of understand how and why, and then again, sort of like bridge divides.
Yeah.
But it's a learning curve to everywhere that you live, and then finding your place within it.
Do you find that those learning curves get steeper and steeper, but that you're able to navigate them better and better because of that background, because you grew up in a way that where there weren't these labels automatically placed, and you now you can step back a little bit and perhaps see through some of that and find proper connection? Does that help in a way relate a little bit more humanness to the stories that you present?
Definitely to the stories, because I feel like there's parts of me that could always identify with somebody in the stories, as a woman, as a person who's lived in different places, with a certain background, or, my own life experience, and being an empath. But I think, it goes back to me saying that fundamentally, I think that people are people, and you just see somebody without any of those adjectives around them, and you just are able to really see somebody as yourself.
And I wonder if that makes a impact, particularly with some of the reporting that you've done in the past and some of the stories that you've put out there, particularly related back to human rights and equality and gender-based issues and social justice. Does that framework allow you to be that much more objective and, again, take away this, and this gets magnified, of course, with election cycles and politics, and take away that blur between fact-based journalism and creating a narrative and, creating stories out there for perhaps not always the best intentions?
At least in my work, obviously now I'm working in a misinformation space here with CBS News Confirmed, but before I was working in international news and a lot of human stories and a lot of women's stories and a lot of women's rights. And as you said, democracy. I think that everything that we do is fact-based, as journalists. And what we're trying to do is dig deeper and really raise the voices of those that are underrepresented. And that's, for example, when I'm talking about women's rights, or I'm talking about democracy, we're looking at like Afghanistan, women cannot sing, they cannot raise their voice. And so I do feel that it's on journalists and women journalists to be able to raise their voices or keep those stories current, because, it's those people don't have that luxury.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, and we're grateful for empowering those people who've been marginalized so that those particular situations can hopefully get fixed. I'm curious about one thing in your particular story. What compelled you to pursue such a unique opportunity with CBS, specifically targeting misinformation?
So first of all, I think that, the initiative of this large organization coming together to really dedicate a unit to fighting misinformation, I found really remarkable, because misinformation, disinformation, it is the story of our time. And obviously in this year that where there were so many elections in the world, where democracy was on the line in so many different countries, it felt really important. And it was also a huge opportunity to use my expertise in very different platforms and different ways of storytelling, having started off in traditional TV and moved to social and audio and newsletters and other ways, to really try to reach people in many different ways, but teaching them and empowering them to be able to teach themselves how to tell what's real and what's not. So it was a great opportunity to be able to do so many different things, but to really make impact. And I think at the core of every single thing I've done throughout my journalistic life and my life in general is really, you're trying to make impact. You're trying to reach people with news that they need, with news that they can use, so that they can have, they have the tools that they need to be able to make wise decisions. I do very firmly believe that a well-informed electorate is the cornerstone to a democracy. Democratic values is something that I think a lot of people take for granted here because they've never had to fight for them. I grew up obviously in Africa. I've lived and reported a lot on human rights. And I think when you talk to those people and you see those struggles and the difference that a democracy really does make in people's lives, it's, we all want freedom. We all want to live in dignity. We all want justice. And it's a big part of what journalists do, holding truth to power.
It provides such a completely different substrate and backdrop for how not only people live their lives, but they consume information and definitely, provide such an impact for the work you do. I'm thinking of all the different layers and rigors that you go through, and, being in part of a unit that is specifically designed to combat misinformation. Do you ever leave even a finished product yet still thinking that there's an element of disbelief to what you're putting out there? Sometimes in the parallel that I can make in the medical profession is that, like, I have all this evidence, I'm making a diagnosis for a patient, and yet I still don't believe it. Are you ever left with that kind of feeling that, like, yes, boy, we've put a story through all the standards, we've fact checked twice, 3 times, 4 times, and yet there still is either some awe or some disbelief in that particular product?
It's not that the way that I would phrase it for stories that are like that, we would never say that we've got some sort of definitive conclusion. It would be more like, here's what we know. So here are the facts that we know, and then here's the stuff that we don't know. Because in some of those cases, there will still be stuff that we don't know, but we can tell you what we do, then give you the questions. Because again, I just don't think that you can tell people that this is this or this is that. It's more like, here are the facts. Here's how you should determine it for yourselves. And we'll show you what we've got, but it's then up to them to interpret that how they like. There are some things, that I can say that this is black or this is white. Now, unfortunately, in the world that we live in today, people will still maybe, argue with that. So,
right.
But again, it's showing how we came to that conclusion of we know is real. I mean, if something is 100% data proof, then it's data proof, but we would give the data and we would show them how we got there.
I guess I'm thinking of, stories like, there are weather related things where look at this. It's New York City. It's Christmas Day and it's like 85 degrees outside, and you can't really argue with that. And yet, boy, it's about as disbelieving as it gets.
I think that's more that a lot of people are sitting on social media looking for ways to have fun. Sometimes it starts out innocently, and they may make a witty comment, or they may say something like, and it kind of spirals and gets out of hand, where it's like that at that point, when with stories like that, we're like, okay, well, don't read about what it's like outside. Look out the window and tell for yourself. Right?
Yeah.
It always comes back to like empowering the person to be able to tell for themselves, or to be able to understand how we got there.
With that same piece, right, there's a very much a reality element here, right? Like you said, look out the window and experience it for yourself. In an age, we've come full circle with chatting about this, where there's information out there, there's rigors to providing that information, there's AI and generative AI and how this sort of informs what we do and how we, digest that information. When you start thinking about the relationships that you build and the vehicles for those relationships for trust, what's your message for those who are consciously trying to combat futility and apathy in that effort to really sort of look outside and experience for themselves and be very intentional and thoughtful about how they gather information? How do people combat that apathy and that futility that sometimes can be a part of this?
I think it's a huge part of it. And I think, when people think about misinformation, they think about somebody just putting out bad information. But actually, what I think we're seeing is people just trying to sow confusion. So say, for example, the example you gave of it being 85 degrees and beautiful, but it's Christmas Day. It's like, see people saying, oh, it's so cold. And then other people saying, oh, it's so hot. And they're just trying to create this confusion so that you're like, you don't know what to believe and you switch off. And yes, it's really hard. It comes back to, as you said, people feeling apathetic, people feeling helpless. And what I want to do is to just keep empowering people to say, you have agency. Stop listening to the noise and just learn these basic tools so that you can tell for yourself, because they want you to feel like it's helpless and you can't believe anything in AI. Everything could be AI. So there's no way until it's real. So I'm just going to say that it's AI and like, oh, I believe this person because I'm deciding to. It's like, no, there's some checks and balances out there that are very, very simple. And you can go and learn for yourself, and it comes back to that media diet. So you want to make sure that you have reliable sources of information. You want to check the dates on things that you're seeing on social media. You want to check the location of where things are said. You want to click into articles you see and read the context. Don't share things out of context. It is one of those most simple things. It could have been like a headline that has been shortened saying it's raining on Christmas and that's all you're seeing. But then what's been cut out is, in 1843. An old article that you're not seeing. So it's really important to click into things to check that and to also check what other media is saying. So you're not ever relying on one source. Social media, you don't know who's being paid to say what. And a lot of times you've got to just like keep yourself in check and check your emotions, because often it's confirmation bias. You are looking for things to confirm what you want it to be. And this isn't necessarily the weather, but if you feel like something's good or bad, you're actively searching for things that will confirm that for you. And I think people need to just pause, take a moment and be like, this is what I'm hearing. I want to check for myself. I'm going to go and check various sources. I'm going to go and speak to people, but science is important. Data is important. Those kind of numbers don't lie. And we are here trying to be a resource for people and trying to show you how we've come to this conclusion. And people have power, people have agency, and they need to stop being in this back seat, feeling like everything's being like told to them, and take their power back and say like, no, I'm choosing my media diet, just like I'm choosing my actual diet. Like I've been saying to you, and it's, we want to live in a world where we can trust media, then let's go out and get that, and hold tech companies to account, make people label things that are AI. Like, again, it comes from consumers wanting this and putting the onus on the other companies to deliver it.
As more and more people are then making those choices, and as you said, choosing their media diet with the work that you're doing, and now in 2025, and I'll get you out of here on this one. What is bringing you joy and optimism in this work in a world where we're constantly combating things and we're constantly trying to stave off misinformation? In the work that you're doing and providing agency for those who are consuming it, what is it that's bringing you joy and optimism as you move ahead?
That's a very tough question.
And I wanted to leave with that because, you live in a world where there's not a lot of, silver linings and daylight sometimes. So I'm curious where you refresh and replenish and find restoration, if you will, in work that's so challenging.
I think one of the nice things is seeing people come together. So this is something that we've seen communities, people, I have seen that our work will make a difference because people are going to begin to think for themselves. So people are also taking time to switch off from phones and news and get outside. And, you know, there is a bigger push for mental health for people to look after themselves. And I think that that's really important. I do think that people are actively seeking out responsible journalism because there is a lot of noise out there. And there's a lot more focus in this country, I think, to local news. And we're seeing that local journalists can really make impact in their communities. And I think that's really, really important. But I think there's a lot of challenges ahead. I think there's a lot of challenges in the polarized society that we live in. But there are a lot of good people out there who are trying to bring people together, who are trying to build bridges, you know, not walls. And that is encouraging. I look at young people today who are out there and trying to bring change and trying to bring communities together, and media literacy organizations which are going into schools and trying to teach people again to tell fact from fiction. And I think that it's great. The one thing that gives me hope is to see my team doing incredible work, coming up with incredible ideas of how we can reach people and trying to make impact and not giving up.
Whether it's having people have that agency and building bridges and making more community around themselves, but particularly seeking out trusted sources. Melissa, we're very grateful for all the work you're doing and so grateful that you were able to spend some time with us. I hope we can visit with you again down the road.
Would love that. Thank you.
You're listening to Trust Me, I Know What I'm Doing. Stay tuned.